All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s, when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This day is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity. Kind of like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too. Having those two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, March 1980, President Jimmy Carter announced the U.S.'s decision to boycott the upcoming Summer Olympics in Moscow. The boycott devastated the hopes of many U.S. athletes, as you can imagine, and there was even more teeth to this because Carter backed it up with a law that promised to revoke the passports of American athletes who traveled to the games in violation of this boycott. This, of course, was in the larger context of the Cold War and a particularly interesting moment in the Cold War. We've talked a little bit on this show about how sports sometimes worked to soften diplomacy between the U.S. and Russia. This was certainly a moment of taking a much harder stance. And to state the obvious, the question of sanctions and carrots and sticks to curb Russian ambitions on the world stage is something that is top of mind right now, not to mention also other questions about sports and diplomacy and so forth. So, really fascinating moment here to discuss, as always, are Nicole Hammer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Poor Jimmy Carter.
I mean, every single time. It's just the worst thing.
I mean, part of this is... You can't catch a break. Part of this is being a president during the Cold War was probably pretty hard, right? But certainly one thing I think about with this story is like Carter's troubles and domestic troubles, and some of that I think affected this decision, but it's also like, you know, if his presidency is going different, this plays maybe in a different way, or if Reagan takes this stance, it just plays in a different way, but for some reason for Carter, as we'll go through, it doesn't play right, and there's backlash and so forth. But let's talk about the decision itself. It does seem like this was a very tough decision for him, Nikki, but what else do we need to know about kind of getting to this moment?
Yeah, I think we need to understand the context, because when we talk about the 1970s and the Cold War, we often talk about it as a time of easing tensions. And that's absolutely the case. In the 1970s, you had this thing called détente, where there was a thaw in the Cold War and everyone was like, maybe better days are ahead. But by the end of the 1970s, that is changing, and it is changing very quickly, particularly with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union sends over 100,000 troops to Afghanistan, and it just launches a war of decimation against Afghanistan during that invasion. Now, they would, like the U.S., get bogged down for a very long time there, but at the time, it felt like to Jimmy Carter, to his national security advisors, that there needed to be a strong response because the Soviet Union was on the march again, right? They were rolling tanks into other countries repeatedly since the mid-1970s, and this was kind of a line in the sand moment.
I think the thing that's so unfortunate about this, though, is in an attempt to stick it to Russia, he kind of stuck it to Americans, you know, because the U.S. Olympians who were wanting to compete, to know that, like, okay, well, if I say I'm going to go anyways, that my passport is going to be revoked, that, like, you know, I mean, that's huge. I think that was the one thing that sort of, not just we're going to boycott or not, we're encouraging you not to go, but go when there are consequences for you, I think sends a different message to Americans than it does to Russians.
I think it matters, too, that this is just after the so-called Miracle on Ice. So this was back when the Winter and Summer Olympics happened in the same year. So you had just had the Winter Olympics in Lake Placid, New York, and the U.S. and the Soviet Union had matched up on the for the gold medal round of the hockey finals, and the Soviet Union was going to win. They were going to decimate the U.S., and somehow the U.S. men's team wins. And it's this moment of, oh, sports can show, sports can fill people's spirits. It can stiffen people's spines. Like, it can be this...
and also, we can stick it to the Russians through sports, right? I mean, even, you know, which I think is part of it, too. And I think a lot of people both were arguing, you know, sports has an opportunity to soften diplomacy, but also sports has a chance to score some wins in the Cold War. And also, you know, I mean, Jesse Owens performed in front of Hitler at the Berlin Olympics.
It's a morale booster.
It's
the optics alone are powerful. It is, sports has always been an incredible platform for politics. And I think we forget that, or we make sport just about the, you know, the athleticism itself. It's so much more than that, especially on large scales like this, in which over, you know, hundreds of countries are being involved. It's a huge stage.
Right. Which, of course, cuts both ways. And I am totally sort of sympathetic or empathetic or understanding of this particular moment and this particular decision, because, as we were saying, the hostage crisis, there's this invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union. It's also important to remember, like you mentioned the détente, Nikki, that was when this was awarded, right? And that's how the Olympics work. You award these games 8-10 years ahead of time. You don't know how geopolitics is going to shift at that point. And I'm sure when they awarded it, they were like, well, this is a moment of softening relations. Maybe this can help. And then all of a sudden, you know, you're in this cycle where the Cold War has trended downward. And you have this decision to make in this particular moment and context.
Yeah, at this time, the Olympics seemed to be going back and forth quite a lot between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and this idea of a kind of exchange that was happening seemed really important to the Olympic Committee, but that, of course, goes south with the invasion of Afghanistan.
Yeah. And Carter really does tie it to the invasion and says it's important to realize how serious a threat the Soviets' invasion of Afghanistan is. And then, you know, he really does try and back this up by rallying the support of the rest of the world. And he sends Muhammad Ali as an ambassador to drum up support for this boycott across Africa. He starts to call other countries. And so, you know, it really does become, and this is where I think it's very resonant to right now, it really becomes this moment of like, what is the world going to do about this? And how are we going to band together and, you know, and take a stand in this moment? And it's relatively successful. I don't think people I certainly don't think I had my head around just how many countries end up following the U.S. in this.
Yeah, about 60, actually over 60 countries follow suit. And I think, to me, I don't know, maybe in the current moment that we're in right now, I think that if this were to happen again, if the Summer Olympics were to take place in Moscow, there would be no question with Ukraine, like how many countries would be on board with that. But I also think that I'm always just sympathetic to the athletes themselves. The same with the pandemic, you know. Yeah. These are people that train for years on end, and because the games are so infrequent, they only really have one, perhaps two opportunities to, you know, to take their craft to the highest level. And so I think while we can be in solidarity as a country, it's still a really individual, difficult decision for people that have been working so hard for something.
And Carter seemed to realize that. I mean, he calls all of these athletes, both Olympic hopefuls and people who had gone to the Olympics before, to the White House to explain what his decision-making process was. And you can watch the video. The Carter Library has it. He walks into the room and nobody stands up, nobody claps. They just sit there silent during his entire speech. And then at the end, they kind of like lightly clap. But there is a real sense that, you know, he's explaining to people who he's taking something from, why he's taking it away from them. And while there's something honorable about like confronting the consequences of the decisions you make as president, it's a hard moment to watch.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, at that event, the White House actually makes the argument. I mentioned, you know, Jesse Owens and the Olympics in Berlin during Nazi Germany. Carter kind of argues that that's a mistake, that was a mistake competing in those Olympics. And I mean, you know, I think we write a story of it was one of defiance, but, you know, I think from a German perspective, and this is the larger context here, hosting an Olympics is a huge boon. And it is, you know, I think there's a term kind of sport washing, right? Which is a kind of way in which people use sports to bolster their reputation. And we saw it with Vladimir Putin, very eager to host the Olympics and the World Cup. We see it with Qatar hosting the World Cup, and it raises all sorts of tricky moral questions. And of course, the athletes are at the sort of short end of the stick of all of this, as we said.
But it's also, I mean, in more, again, current conversations, hosting the Olympics has also been a detriment. You know, it's been something that a lot of cities have said, no, we don't want this because it costs so much. There's actually not a lot of profit in the long run. It's a short-term thing, and it causes a lot of havoc for cities that are trying to get prepared for this, you know, 2-3 week event.
Yeah, totally. We should clarify one thing, which is, you know, the president doesn't control the U.S. Olympic Committee directly. You know, he sort of has to convince the U.S. Olympic Committee. But so the U.S. Olympic Committee eventually does vote, seemingly reluctantly by some members, to say, okay, we won't attend.
Yeah, although Carter makes clear that he has his ways of preventing people from doing this. He's like, I could just ban all travel to Russia. So
yeah, I know. It's like he controls
make
the
your
State
decision.
Department. He's like, I've got your passport.
There is an attempt, and again, I think this comes from, you know, an acknowledgement of how serious of an issue a decision this was. But there is an attempt to make some sort of amends with the U.S. Olympians. For one, they award each one of them a congressional gold medal that summer, you know, which is like, what gold medals do we have lying around? You know, they wanted a gold medal. Okay, there's a drawer full of congressional gold medals. Sure. And then they stage a bunch of like track and field events and other sort of things domestically. I don't think any Olympian is saying, oh, well, this makes up for it.
Yeah.
No, they're furious. You see that too. Like Carter had said in his speech to the athletes that they can go out and they can say whatever they want. He hopes they understand, but he's not trying to muzzle them. And they go out and they say what they want, and including filing a lawsuit against the U.S. Olympic Committee in 1980 because they had been robbed of this opportunity. In fact, one of the rowers who obviously didn't get to go to the Olympics called the boycott a pointless exercise and a shameful part of U.S. history.
Yeah.
You know, I also think it's kind of interesting. There's a runner, Steve Page, who was a strong contender for a medal in the 800 meters. And he recalled just his heartbreak in 2012. And in the interview, he says, but I got my revenge. I became a Republican that year. It's like, oh, burn. But I mean, like there are real political consequences, I think, to these decisions that we shouldn't take lightly. And, you know, and Carter felt that every step of the way. He certainly felt that at the ballot box during campaign season.
Yeah, for sure. And then in terms of other fallout as well, well, first off, it is an interesting question of, you know, kind of all the things that led Carter to not get reelected. I wonder, yeah, they all flow together. There's no one particular thing, but it's an interesting wrinkle, this one. The other fallout, of course, is that the Soviet Union in turn boycotts the next round of Olympics, which are in the United States. And, you know, when now all of a sudden you're talking about two cycles where there isn't sort of quote unquote full competition, especially between two large, very good sporting countries. You just think about athletes who happened to live in that era and not really being able to be on the world stage, the pinnacle of their sport against their best competition. You know, there's a sort of real loss there.
But it makes me also feel like, are these athletes pawns? You know, are we just using them as political tools to maneuver and do our bidding, or our propaganda bidding, one way or the other. That doesn't feel fair.
Right. But I mean, that question quickly leads you to just ask a question about the fundamental sort of project of the Olympics. And should we be doing these competitions where everyone sort of is organized by country and wrap themselves in the flag and they listen to the national anthem? I mean, once you sort of decide to do that, it's going to get political in my opinion.
It's a slippery slope.
Yeah. The USOC does seem to continue to acknowledge how difficult this was, and actually quite recently, just in the last year or so, issued I think it's a formal apology of sorts, right?
An almost apology, I think, is how the New York Times put it. But they acknowledged, not necessarily that the boycott was the wrong thing to do, but to acknowledge how much it hurt the athletes in 1980, that something real was taken away from them, and that there needed to be some acknowledgement of what it had cost them to boycott this Olympics.
Yeah. I mean, I will say the statement last year or 2 years ago from the USOC says, quote, "It is abundantly clear in hindsight that the decision not to send a team to Moscow had no impact on the global politics of the era and instead only harmed you, American athletes who had dedicated themselves to excellence." They do use the word hindsight there, so I get it. But, it is truly like, in hindsight, sure, you could say that, but then you don't also get to say the miracle on ice was important because it showed, you can't just make decisions in hindsight. And so I found that statement to be a little slippery, or an attempt to kind of mollify. Obviously, it's 40 years later. We, quote unquote, won the Cold War. So sure, whatever, put out this statement. It also, again, didn't seem to really work. Athletes don't seem to still be pretty bitter about their lost chance.
Understandably, because as Kellie was saying, sometimes you just get a cycle or two. And in the absence of the Olympics, your mind fills in all the what ifs with the most, with the biggest possible losses, right? Oh, I could have medaled. Oh, I could have won gold, because you have no way of knowing because you didn't get to participate.
Or you could have lost and you could have came in last. I mean, I think we always make this what ifs, like I could have been a champion,
a contender.
Most likely you might have lost. The odds aren't always in Americans' favor, but I think we all like to believe that we would come out victorious. That's not necessarily the case either.
All right. Well, we will leave it there. So many parallels to not just, specifically Russia, but just diplomacy and sport and all these things that are still swirling today. It's, it will continue to be tricky territory forever, I would say. All right. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Soviet troops were all over the place in Afghanistan today.
The action was met with condemnation from all around the globe. U.S. President Jimmy Carter issued an ultimatum.
And I have notified the Olympic Committee that with Soviet invading forces in Afghanistan, neither the American people nor I will support sending an Olympic team to Moscow.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. We can only make the show with your support. If you want to support the show and the network, you can do it at thisdaypod.org. Also on our website, you can sign up for our newsletter. You can also see transcripts of the show. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kala Nakua helps with transcripts and the newsletter. Thanks to Julie Shapiro and Audrey Martovich, executive producers at Radiotopia. Thanks to the whole team at Radiotopia and PRX. If you have any questions or comments or ideas about the show, get in touch, thisdaypod@gmail.com, or find us on social media at thisdaypod. My name is Jody Avirgan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon. Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's ODOO.com/thisday.
Radiotopia.